Thanks everybody for joining. I'm seeing the participants coming in the room, and we're going to get started in just a couple minutes at 3 o'clock. So we'll kind of wait for everybody to get in the room, and we'll get going. All right, for those of y'all who are joining or just entering the room, we're going to give everybody a minute or two more. We have over 300 or around 350 people registered for this event, and we're at about 110. So sometimes it's tricky to log on to the webinars, so we'll give everybody just a minute or two as we watch that number tick up so we don't kind of rush in and have you guys kind of tagging along, trying to catch up on those first couple slides. If you can, if you could enter your name and your agency in the chat box, it'll help with our records to kind of know who the audience is and how we can direct our questions and our contacts. Thanks. See a lot of regional steering committee members and their watershed coordinators joining. Really excited to see all y'all join. I think we could probably get started on just introducing where we are today. Thanks everyone for joining us on this cool Wednesday in Louisiana. I think it's our first cool front to talk about watershed governance or regional watershed management as part of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative statewide effort. My name is Alexandra Carter. I work for the Office of Community Development, managing CDBG mitigation funds on behalf of the Watershed Initiative, and alongside our partnering agencies, including DOTD, CPRA, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. We do all this work on behalf of the Watershed Council, which is made up of all of our agency heads. Just as a kind of quick refresher, as everybody's joining, we did notice we had a couple of registrants that may be new to this work. And so to kind of make sure we have all the context around the Watershed Initiative in this larger discussion, just as a refresher, the Watershed Initiative, or what we kind of commonly refer to as the LWI, it was stood up in response to the devastating effects of the 2016 Great Floods to build more resilience in the state's all too familiar cycle of disaster and recovery, which we're kind of experiencing in live terms today. So just keeping in mind the efforts funded by a $1.2 billion CDBG mitigation allocation from the Department of Housing and Urban Development with HUD. And it's a little unique in that it's mitigation funds. So these funds can be used to look forward in reducing the effects of disasters before they happen. So a lot of this work is planning at this point. But it's looking at improving management at a regional scale. And this is being sort of couched in terms of, I think, like three big components, which is, managing water based on how it naturally moves throughout the state around watershed boundaries, institutionalizing capability and capacity to continuously confront these big mounting water risks statewide, and then also to sort of build and improve our suite of tools that we use based on science and data to improve our decision making and our project management and development. I'm joined today by Dr. Dowsett, professor at LSU. He's been working really closely with Region 7, and if this sounds new, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, to troubleshoot their discussions on governance and regional watershed management. And his research interests are really focused on how place-based systems adapt to social, economic, and environmental change through the lenses of law and policy and economic geography. And this is just very relevant. These are key considerations in the next steps of the Watershed Initiative in this program. And I think on behalf of all the regions and the state, I just want to express our thanks in having him join us today and share his expertise. So, Dr. Dowsett, do you want to add a couple words before we jump in?
Thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of these people engaged in such important work in Louisiana, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
We're really glad to work together, right? It's going to take a big team to see this work through, and thankfully we have a lot of people eager to work alongside. Okay, so just a quick overview of the agenda for today's webinar, and a couple of housekeeping items. The first bit is going to kind of be about the context, just to make sure we're all sort of understanding where we are in the program, how this webinar fits in, and the work that it's meant to sort of move forward. We'll do a little recap of the regional governance process. There's some exercises that are happening across the state. This is one piece of those exercises. And then Dr. Dowsett will go through and do case studies and examples of other states to really expand understanding around this decision-making process, potential next steps, think through some trade-offs, and to help us all sort of grapple with the next steps in our decision-making. And he'll talk through this governance 101, answering these difficult questions of the 4 R's and how to grapple with that and move forward. And we'll have about an hour, and we're hoping to keep at least 20 minutes for Q&A. We might get there sooner. The webinar, again, is an hour and a half. We'll finish around 4:30. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording. We're also live streaming on Facebook, and we will post the recording online after the webinar is completed. Everyone is muted, and your videos are turned off. So if you're trying to figure out where that video toggle is or the mute button is, it's not there, and you're okay. We've automatically done that, just given the large number of people that are in the room. If you have questions, we are going to kind of try to make this as kind of open-ended and conversational as possible, given the constraints of the webinar. So send them through the Q&A. If you're watching on Facebook, send them through as a comment on Facebook. We're going to be, grappling with it all as it comes in, and we want to hear what y'all think and help to sort of guide the conversation in working together with y'all through that. Apart from that, I think we're good. We can go ahead and get started, and as best we can, make this as enjoyable as possible, given the sort of the point at which we are in the program. So a little bit on the context. This is, I think, the kind of funner part. It's the big picture. For those of y'all who are joining us for the first time, the Watershed Initiative is this big program. It's working across multiple initiatives that are happening at the same time, right? So we're launching a statewide modeling effort, and we're launching $100 million worth of round 1 projects to build and demonstrate how we can do this work really well across the state and begin to immediately reduce flood risk. And we're also aligning our state agencies, policies and procedures, and having all of us work together to make every dollar and every bit of effort we move forward leverage what's already going on and achieve multiple objectives. The Regional Capacity Building Grant Program looks at the Watershed Initiative from a different position and saying that, look, it's more than projects. It's more than aligning our agencies. It's more than understanding. We've got to make sure that there are also vehicles in place to facilitate difficult decision making at a local and a regional level. And at this point in the state of Louisiana, there really isn't a scale for that decision making. And so this program really looks at establishing that scale, that rippling effect, institutionalizing capacity. We often see with our disasters, stand up in capacity. Everybody learns how to do this really well, and then the disaster's over and they all kind of scatter. We want to institutionalize that and continuously address our flood risk concerns, begin to bring those real reductions in risk over time. And so we've issued this grant to 8 entities across the state, and they're listed here. And they are coordinating activities within each of these regions towards this mission of making a recommendation for long-term regional watershed management or governance, to sort of institutionalize decision-making, authority, and processes that can really get to the heart of the work that needs to take place at the regional scale. And so this part of the discussion is really unpacking some key components and considerations of that, some lessons learned through case studies across the country. And so just know that's kind of where we are. And a lot of this is geared towards the steering committee members who are joining. I see them popping up in the chat, so I'm really glad to see them join and listen and kind of get this context, because the next steps in their exercises are really focusing on who could be doing regional watershed management in their region and how that work could be implemented. So much of this is going to be very relevant to them, and so I just can't extend our thanks enough in being glad that y'all are here and paying attention and checking out this process. So to kind of spend a little bit more time on unpacking the process that we're in, we ask ourselves these kind of 3 big questions at the regional scale. What is the work that needs to be done? We absolutely don't want to reinvent the wheel. We do not want to task people with tasks that are already being done. And so we really have spent time with each of the regions across the state to talk about the flood risk concerns they have and distill those down to root cause analysis. We've had, I think, 2 regions that have struggled only because they keep getting hit by storms. And so all of them have done this flood risk discussion. Some of them are about to do this first exercise, but for the most part, we're moving into exercise 2 across the state, where we start to think about the entities that exist in each region. We have a guidebook. We've done extensive research to say, okay, these are all the water-related entities in your area, and think about what they're doing and the gaps and the spatial distribution of them. And just to kind of go back to this slide, this is a large scale, and so there's a challenge to that. It crosses multiple parishes. The organization around this is challenging, and so thinking about who exists that could potentially be amended, or authorities could be adjusted, or whether or not there is anyone, any agency that could do this work. Maybe you need a new agency, right? And so we're having these discussions, and we're starting those now. And then once we reach agreement with these regional steering committees on the who, we shift into how, right? Which is really getting to what is this long-term regional governance or regional watershed management entity. We sometimes refer to them as coalitions. It's more loose. There's a lot to interpret there. And I think the way that we look at it in Louisiana is, each region is different. We expect there to be some right sizing. And so we really want to make the regions and the state work really well together and come into these solutions. And so we'll come to the how and really start to provide action items for implementation, we're hoping by year's end. When we talk about implementation and recommendations, I think it's important to acknowledge that at this point in the program, we've had a lot of challenges. We've had a lot of storms that have disrupted the workflow. We have COVID, which has put everything online. In some ways, that's made it more accessible. In some ways, it hasn't. And so there's a lot of challenges with really making sure that we're reaching all the stakeholders that we need to and communicating this as well as we need to, because it's big decision making for the state of Louisiana. And so what we've tweaked with the program at this point is to say, the recommendations that the regional steering committees come to by the end of the year are provisional, meaning they're iterative. They are going to be vetted and they're going to be revisited. And so we'll get those recommendations and we'll kind of go on the road as much as we possibly can and have sort of one-on-one meetings between January and April where we'll engage with parish leadership and stakeholders in the public to present those recommendations and get their feedback. And then we'll come back in May, between May and June, and basically represent the recommendations to the steering committees with the feedback from the public and say, okay, is there anything we want to adjust or change based on feedback that we've received, and in collaboration with parish leadership and the public. And so we still have quite the road ahead of us, but we're in the midst of coming up with those recommendations. And so this is a really timely point that we're at in the process. And so let's see. Some of the common themes, just to kind of orient where we are, is we're seeing sort of a focus on these root causes, right? We're seeing that in the state, there is a lack of watershed planning and project design. Some areas are focusing on project design that may have, lower operations and maintenance costs, or watershed planning that focuses on operations and maintenance. A lack of regional or state consistency and guidance on higher standards. Some regions are really clear that they need the state to lead on this. Others are a little reluctant towards looking to higher standards and are taking a more of a encouraging perspective. I think consistently across all the regions, we've seen this lack of education, and I would say like flood risk education is really what we're talking about, and outreach to support funding for flood protection. And that's not always because of people not trying to educate or to talk about flood risk. It's often the tools we use to communicate flood risk just weren't designed for that purpose, right? So using FEMA flood maps to talk about flood risk is just inherently challenging because it doesn't project forward future risk. And sometimes they're outdated, right? And so they're also, I think, at the regional scale, when we start to talk about how local decisions push up to the state, there's a lot of unclear responsibilities related to waterway and channel maintenance. There are a lot of players, but where they start and stop and end is somewhat difficult, and it's a difficult field to navigate. And we're seeing different degrees of success depending on where you are or who you're talking to in a given area of the state. And then lastly, we are seeing a consistent issue related to inadequate funding for infrastructure and O&M and operation and maintenance. That, we build things and we need to really think about how we maintain them, and what we build and how we think about maintenance is really important across the state of Louisiana, because there is a need for flood control infrastructure, but we're seeing that we've got a lot of aging infrastructure that we're having a whole separate set of challenges with. And so as we talk about these issues across the region, the idea is this is what a future coalition could work towards addressing these issues. And those potential solutions could manifest basically with increased capacity, increased accountability. In some instances, you might just need roles and responsibilities to just be more clearly defined, or you might need more best practices research, or you might need leaders to have authority to make difficult choices that they just don't have at this point. And then sometimes I think we've seen that it's a process that is needed for increased coordination. And so kind of threading those needles, which is the root cause that ties to the potential solution, is what we've been working on over the last couple weeks. And, when we talk about future coalitions, I think it's important to mention and continue to reiterate, what does it look like? How do we go from these problems and potential solutions to something that manifests in reality? And so this could mean a regional coalition could provide project funding, operations, and maintenance, right? That would mean generating revenue and borrowing money. It could mean creating some consistency and higher standards, or even recommending to the state to create consistency and higher standards. And speaking on behalf of the parishes, they could adopt and enforce development codes or similar sort of minimum project development standards. They could manage project planning, develop and execute a watershed plan. That plan could regulate development, and they could provide data and support. And this would be, in direct relationship to the statewide modeling effort the Watershed Initiative is working on. And so what Dr. Duff is going to do is kind of take these considerations and really move it into examples, like how can we further unpack this and look at how other states have done this work. And, there are some clear duties that are emerging from our sort of hypothetical discussions with watersheds. And so we're going to kind of look into more of those potential solutions today with these case studies. All right, Dr. Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, you might be on mute.
The way that these sort of cases are organized is around some of the key functions that a watershed organization or coalition might have. And they're ones that you're going to consider to what extent you want your regional coalition or organization to focus on. And really my perspective on this is the importance of aligning the watershed's mission, scope, and organizational and functional structure and capabilities. And the next section, we talk about sort of a framework for thinking about that, which is rules, resources, relationships, and reporting. But before that, we want to talk about what are we doing those things around. And so one of the first ones is project funding, operation, and maintenance. And what's important here? Well, there's a lot of different ways to go around this. Are we going to focus our funding on grants and disaster recovery, or are there going to be activities in our mission that are going to need more stable, annualized sources of revenue, especially around things such as maintenance and operations? So if we go to the next slide, we have two examples here, and they're somewhat counter examples, and we'll give you a little bit of the context of them. So Minnesota has statewide watershed districts, and they operate under a statewide Watershed Management Act, which has standards throughout the state, and it allows the districts to be set up, take grants and public funds, enter into contracts, but it also has dedicated funding streams for them. In part, that's because they have a role in reviewing watershed development standards and regulatory issues. So these are more government-led districts in Minnesota. Colorado, on the contrary, has a program called the Watershed Resilience Pilot Program, where they had some serious flooding in 2013, I think it was 2010, and in many districts that were quite rural or quite amenity-based in their state, where there's a lot of environmental activity already, and they wanted to set up watershed plans and a funding structure for spending their money, sort of in a somewhat similar way to what's happening in Louisiana. And they used a very voluntary nonprofit model in that state, many of them which built on existing groups that were already in the area. But it's important to know that the long-term fate of these organizations is going to be a function of the ability of those coalitions, or the desire of those coalitions, to seek out funds and sort of sustain themselves as nonprofits. And it's important to know, right? So one of them, there's an important anchoring into the regulatory process, the standard setting, and the other one is sort of about how can we be innovative about spending recovery resources, and promoting innovation. Maybe we can go to the next. Do you have any other comments?
Yeah, I was going to mention too that as we get into these different case studies, that there isn't necessarily just one right way of doing this, right? That there are a range of approaches, and that's what we're really going to get into. That diverse types of organizations can sort of divest into these processes, and so I think we just want to make sure that y'all are understanding, and we understand collectively that Louisiana is not the first state to do this. But we're investigating where there are successful strategies or lessons learned that we can take from other places to inform our unique approach to this. And so, to the point that you're making, Minnesota, it's very they're very committed to this. They have long-term funding sources. They make it sustainable in that way, and there's some security in that. Whereas with Colorado, there's a little bit more. It's more voluntary, and it's more of a nonprofit basis. And so you see some kind of reminds me of like sales tax and property tax. They're very different. One fluctuates a lot, and the other one is pretty dependable. And I mean, I think that's kind of one of the ways that I look at this.
That's correct.
And we do have a question about whether or not your background is a faux background in the Q&A. Is it real?
Unfortunately, I am not in LSU's quad. I'm in the scientific area of campus, which is somewhat less glamorous and tree and shady, and I'm in my office.
Perfect, right? If only that were the case. It's a really beautiful day.
I'd be having to wear a mask outside, as per.
Right.
We have one additional question, if y'all don't mind. Before we move to this next one, I want to highlight, we have the question from Mr. Pat Gordon. How can a nonprofit tax or regulate? I think that's an important thing to address.
Yeah.
Do y'all want to get on that one?
And I think that that's an important comparison here. Now there's another example from Colorado, from their urban areas, where they have different metropolitan-based watershed approaches, and they also have that in Minnesota. But in Minnesota, they've given some regulatory authority and some long-term stable governing authority to their watershed districts. Colorado did not take that approach. Many of these were relatively rural areas, or areas that were sort of in exurban, rural, urban fronts. And the Watershed Resilience Pilot Program creates and implements a plan, and to the effect that the plan is implemented, I think it has strong weight on project funding for CDBG funds. But to the extent that changes in management are recommended in those plans, it's really persuasive on local governments.
Yeah.
They have very big counties, though. That's another component of that. Yeah.
And I mean, just to clarify, because I'm not sure, a nonprofit can't tax or regulate, right? Like that's not
correct. They would need
right,
authority through the state or through the counties or municipalities if under the state's law that's authorized under the function. So that would be. And
in Colorado's example, they don't have that, right? They're not taxing and regulating.
They do not have that. Yeah, exactly. Though the recovery grant ones do not. Yeah, and so those are often relatively small watersheds too. So it's kind of a community-driven, innovation-driven, persuasion-driven approach.
Right, and it would be more like a 501c3. It's those voluntary nonprofits that kind of crop up for a project and then kind of stand down after it's completed. It's kind of and if any of y'all were able to join us last year in the Best Practices Summit, we talked with Colorado, and that was one of the things that they said was a trade-off. You know, it was more voluntary. It's more of an encouraging type of thing. So there was a lot of standing up and setting down and a lot of capacity building. And they didn't have a continuum of like people and expertise that could sort of carry through and see a long-term benefits that were consistent, more like the Minnesota approach.
And so this other standards one, and maybe we don't even have to use higher standards, but there's a question of standards at the watershed level, right? Because there's this, to some extent, a mismatch from the environmental geography to the government geography. So parish boundaries are not the same as watershed boundaries. Municipal boundaries are not the same as watershed boundaries. And when you have fragmented jurisdictional authority in a region, it's sometimes hard for local governments to take action on some challenging issues that might impose local costs when they're afraid that their regional neighbors won't. And it can create sometimes it can create innovation and good options, but sometimes it can create potentially a race to the bottom in terms of certain standards. And if that's a concern of yours in your region, there's a question of what's the role that the organization should have in that process. What vision would you like to have? So if we go to the next slide, and that's been dealt with differently in certain areas. So in Minnesota, as we're mentioning, they do have floodplain regulatory review and standards that the watershed districts are set up. And in Colorado, while the recovery watershed program it was basically a voluntary coalition model. The Colorado Mile High Flood District, which is in Metro Denver, and there's a similar organization in Colorado Springs. So these are in more urban areas that have more common urban problems. They do have statutory authority to adopt and enforce multi-jurisdictional floodplain regulations, although we see a lot of the ways that they use that is through a persuasive planning process. They work with local authorities. They are constituted by these local governing authorities, and that's an important question to consider. If there are any regulatory decisions to be made by that organization, there has to be buy-in from local governments who traditionally have that power in our governance systems. And the issue with Denver is that they also have, unlike their recovery watershed units, the Denver and Colorado Springs examples in Colorado have dedicated millages, and both of these were enacted through state laws.
Right, and I would just add too, one of the questions we got from the Q&A is whether or not the programs in Minnesota and Colorado had received federal funding similar to the CDBG MID funding. And I think that some of them are like that. They're using it as seed money to fund the projects in Colorado. I don't know, but I think maybe you do, whether or not Minnesota's was set up similarly, maybe at the onset.
Well, Minnesota's programs are much older. They've been evolving since Minnesota's had some of this framework since the 50s, and it really was crystallized into what it is now in the 70s, when there started to be more environmental concerns, especially about some agricultural pollution and runoff, and then urban pollution and runoff. And both of these organizations are enabled under state statute to, both of these organizational models here, to receive funds and apply for grants. So that's something they can do, that it doesn't have to be only a millage or only a stable funding source, right? And so that there can be a mix of these. So especially for project or initiative-based efforts that they might have, they have that capability.
And we'll talk a little bit about Iowa in a minute, and they receive CDBG monies to kind of set up their data modeling programs that are similar to what the Watershed Initiative is doing. So I think that we do sometimes see this being a catalyst for these types of statewide efforts. And I think with this particular allocation from HUD, that's a direct kind of objective, right? To really make this work regional, to look at a regional scale and maximize the impact of these project dollars and these planning dollars, not just for today, but for generations to come. So I think that there's a shift in the way we're thinking about these allocations as being sort of disaster recovery versus, how do we make this more sustainable and start to reduce our flood risks incrementally over time in a more effective way to help, be in a safer, better place for all Louisiana citizens. I did want to mention too, the discussion of how the inconsistency in standards across the regions. We have heard that, right? We've heard that in multiple regions that they're concerned, and this is happening now, right? Where you have parishes with lower development regulations and neighboring parishes and kind of sort of builders and development shifts, and you have sort of this checkerboard effect where, you might have more restrictive requirements in a parish that's trying to really reduce its flood risk. And so that inconsistency really impacts the whole watershed, the whole area where the water is naturally moving in your region. So having that consistency, I think it creates a fairness to everybody who lives in it together and has to collectively assume the impacts of all those activities. And so we have heard that, and I think a lot of these regions are very aware of that as a potential outcome, maybe not in requiring it as much, but encouraging it, using the data and the models to explain it to the citizens and the parish leaders. And in some instances, I think they would try to promote or require consistency if the opportunity presented itself maybe in a decade, like 10 years from now, maybe sooner, but it just depends on where you are in the state.
Just real quick, y'all, before we move to the next one, I do want to highlight one other comment that we're getting from Wade. It says, Florida has water management districts that get tax funds and regulate. They're focused in both water usage and water quality. I think that's a common theme that some of the entities in other states are focused on two things, right? Not just flooding, but also water quality. Just highlighting that. If y'all want to elaborate, go right ahead.
Well, so those are often, one of the reasons is what motivates us to form organizations, right? It's a lot of work, it's a headache. If there weren't problems, we wouldn't form organizations to solve them. And one motivation is compliance with federal environmental law. The Clean Water Act has impaired water programs, a 303D program. It also has a non-point management pollution structure. And areas where that's been an issue or prioritized have often organized regionally around that, and especially in areas that have started that process and also faced hazard issues, they've incorporated those two elements. So stormwater management, for example, in Denver, that's a big part of the rationale for many of the operations there. So it's not just flooding and hazards. And
Yeah,
there are
I
often
think
co-benefits. Yeah, sorry. I was going to say that one thing is that there are also co-benefits. There are differences, and there are different motivations and priorities and trade-offs, but there are co-benefits. Many things that we do to store and retain water to reduce flood hazard risk, make streams less flashy, also reduces pollutant loads.
Exactly. And you know, the Watershed Initiative, we're partners with the EQ. And I think one of the things that we've really worked to try to not get in the way of too is all this work related to water quality and management that deals more with sort of groundwater, right? So like we're aware of other efforts that are looking to long-term water codes that could facilitate on a whole different slew of solutions. And we're hoping that at minimum we can sort of leverage and work with them to maybe achieve two outcomes. But at the same time, we kind of need to realize that in Louisiana, just tackling water risk is huge, right? We face enormous risk across the whole state. We've got 64 parishes. All of them have had disaster declarations in the last 10 years. And so just trying to tackle this one challenge in its sort of singular way is a lot. But with that being said, the mission of the Watershed Initiative is to not only reduce risk and improve the function of the floodplain, but to do it by maximizing the natural functions of the floodplain. So this includes looking at, you know, natural channel design, nature-based solutions, looking at and analyzing how this could have, the projects that we develop could have impacts on water quality, on ecosystem management, and where we can improve those things as secondary benefits to reducing flood risk. So I think even though in terms of this program and the way we look at regional flood risk, we have really kind of focused on flood risk mitigation, but the program itself and the larger mission is sort of dual focused in making sure we seize every opportunity to improve those other water quality and groundwater and other water related challenges as best we can with the funds that we have, and to continue to leverage funds and efforts to further those workflows.
And there's also a mention of levee districts in Louisiana, and I'd say that's a great example. One slight potential difference is they don't necessarily attend the stormwater question, right? And so the question is their institutional mandate in relation to some of the other issues that are being faced in the state. And one real question in terms of watershed plan development and execution, and I'll segue through that observation, is who do you include in the planning process? That planning process, how do you engage local stakeholders who are important decision makers? How do you engage and include existing organizations that have important missions that are sometimes parallel to yours? What is the implication of the plan, right? Is it somehow under state law, so as it is in Minnesota, is it given is there a statewide consistency requirement, right? That local governments must conform to these watershed plans through state law. And then the implementation and maintenance of that plan. And that's really, you know, how important it is to bring in the important stakeholder mix and do that in a way that you're really quantifying benefits to your region in a way that resonates and can be measured. So if we come back to these watershed, the next slide here.
Yeah, I would just add too that, you know, just keeping in mind for those of, you know, a lot of the levee districts are represented on the steering committees, and they're also taken into account in our analysis of existing structures and authorities within each region. So we are we're looking at those and seeing that spatial distribution and thinking about, like Dr. That's just saying, you know, what are the limits of authority? What are they empowered to do? What are they empowered not to do? And I think to sort of acknowledge, you know, John Sheehan, who we're working with right now on looking at the NHD, you know, and this is another good example. You know, we're in the process of doing river and rain gauge enhancements, you know, adding 100 gauges across the state of Louisiana, including water quality instrumentation, right, to be able to not only look at emergency response, but also monitor water quality, and where we can enhance data sets that are relevant to that through the modeling effort that's underway. We're really trying to make all these connections really help with multiple efforts. And so I think, Evelyn, did we get to Kyle's question? I keep trying to see it, but it's kind of behind there's one other question I want to make sure we get.
We're getting questions rolling in, and y'all please go ahead and continue to do that. If we don't get to it in the context of like a section of this presentation, we will get to it at the end. Let me read this one out for y'all. If watershed management coalitions become regulatory authorities, how can we mitigate that additional burden on project implementation? And what we're getting at here, right, is like what hoops do you have to jump through in permitting for a project, right? He says existing permitting framework already adds considerable cost and time to many projects, especially large-scale projects seeking to decrease flood risk. Perhaps a new framework could expedite permitting by decentralizing approval authority.
I mean, I think part of the notice, the Federal Register notice, with this allocation for the CDBG. So like, even though the Watershed Initiative is much bigger than the CDBG NIT funds, one of the things that we do look at is how to expedite the permitting of projects. And we're working closely with the Corps for this particular fund source to be able to do that. But I think your implication is a good one, that like there is an economy of scale, you know, taking your work maybe out of a bigger pool and putting it into a smaller pool. And that like we would want to continue to kind of consider those options in these types of authorities and work through potential solutions that could manifest. I think that's one that I haven't heard a lot about, but I think we're about to get into a whole different sort of ballgame of project implementation and development with round one, and I'm sure this is going to come up more. And so I appreciate that comment. I think it's a good piece to really be thinking about as we move forward with these recommendations.
Of course, I'm not a policymaker in Louisiana, and my work doesn't aim to guide you in enforcing stricter or different standards than the ones that are existing now. It's sort of understanding the implications of that. And standards, though, can be structured in different ways. So they could be regionalized in an expedited way. They could be put through a consistency framework that considers some of those questions, right? There are many different approaches to think about rulemaking in this process. And what the Watershed, I think, approach does is recognize that, for example, in Region 7, where I've done a lot of the work, there are 45 municipalities with independent land use authority. There are 8 parishes with independent land use authority. And there are cross-cutting issues related to flooding and coastal storm surge that they share. And the question is, does it make sense in that region to think about some commonalities, right, that can give greater certainty in the permitting and regulatory process, and also maybe reduce risks. But that's a consideration that local decision makers, right, our democratic process, eventually has to attend to. So the last example is Iowa. And so Iowa, much like Colorado, does not have a statewide watershed law in the way Minnesota does. And they used flood recovery from big floods, I think in 2010, right? Then they have large river flooding issues. And they also have major issues with agricultural pollution in certain areas from their livestock and cattle industry. The question, though, what they did in Iowa is incorporate modeling and modeling support into the decision process, and try to bring that to as many people as possible and give as many people possible tools to engage with that so they can better understand the ramifications in terms of the hydrology of the decisions they take in terms of conservation, infrastructure, and other planning at the watershed level, which is done at a very also sort of coalition-based, voluntary-based question. But then that brings up lots of questions about who stores and maintains models and data. We don't want to make a lot of expensive models just for them to sit on the shelf and be, useless in our decision-making process. How is that data incorporated? Are there structures to incorporate that in decision-making? How do people get involved with modeling, right? What is this not, it can't be in an ivory tower. And who frames the questions and sets that? So, and then what are there differences with the models?
Right, and I think too, before we switch over to the next slide, just to kind of provide some context on the Watershed Initiatives modeling, we're actively engaging now with watershed coordinators and stakeholders with modeling kind of expertise and backgrounds across the state to begin to develop recommendations for a long-term model maintenance, storage, and use. And so hopefully, by the end of this process where we have recommendations for regional coalitions, we'll also have a recommendation sort of side by side that looks at how these models should be used, stored, maintained. And then we'll switch gears to sort of develop those decision support tools that will help locals and regional and state stakeholders access model outputs and inform their decision making. I am seeing also a question about the soil and conservation districts. I think this is a really good one. So they're also featured prominently in the regional steering committees. We have them as a recommended member, and we're also working to I would say build a better relationship with Ag and Forestry, the state agency. They weren't originally in the executive order, but we do have some work to do, I think, in broadening the agency input across multiple state agencies. And we've heard that request before, and so there's more work that needs to be done, but I think we're getting where we need to, and we're getting that input through the steering committees through this process.
Yeah, and that's a characteristic of managing watersheds, is that they're really different sources of authority. So natural resources, fish and wildlife is largely responsible for, the Soil Conservation Service is largely responsible for agricultural pollution programs and runoff that comes out of the 30s. And that existed when they created the Clean Water Act structure in the 1970s. And so that was maintained. And so there's sort of a split between what the Clean Water Act and what the soil conservation laws concern. And then the whole other areas of disaster recovery and flooding are dealt with through FEMA and, CDBG HUD monies. And so there's a question of not only how do you get together different geographies when you're managing watersheds, it's how do you get together very different programmatic paradigms as well. And so in Iowa, this theme of horses for courses maybe would be that Iowa is a largely rural state with agricultural pollution and riverine flooding, and one of the approaches they took was setting up a state data center, a state modeling center to support these voluntary watershed coalitions. And now these watershed coalitions heavily engage with agriculture and help set up and coordinate watershed plans and investment. And the coalitions tend to have a mix of stakeholders from municipal and local actors, but also actors from state agencies, management agencies, but also the important industry groups in the different areas. And they really took a data-centric approach based on this. In part, though, it's because Iowa has many different large tracts of land. And so decision-making over big 1,000-acre tracts of land, right, is a little easier to break down some of those decisions than when you maybe have much more smaller parcels in different areas. And the other issue, as you'll note with Iowa, is it's whether the coalition is set up in the watershed for planning purposes. They can support that through that central hub, in part because not every region of the state has elected to build these watershed coalitions. And the question is, for you guys, in part, is to consider, do we want to have a patchwork here, or are the hazard-based issues in Louisiana ones that might consider a more comprehensive coverage?
All right, I think that's a really important consideration, especially for when we think about long-term model storage maintenance and use. You know, we've got, I think, some local groups who want to keep their models and keep them regionally, of others that I think may want to defer to the state. And you might see sort of a sort of blended approach where some are more maintained locally or regionally than others, and so as we see this sort of process manifest, I think it's really valuable to look at Iowa and think about, like, this is one perspective on the data and the modeling. And I see a comment in the chat box just to kind of unpack the modeling a little bit for those of you who may be new to it. I don't want to spend too much time because we could spend all day. We spent a month talking about modeling. All right, I think Ian with the OTD is all on the phone. I'm sure he's laughing. But ultimately, the modeling across the state of Louisiana is going to be done at a HUC 8 level. It's going to be consistent with watershed boundaries at a sort of parish-wide scale. It's going to be tied to those hydrologic boundaries. They're not going to be jurisdictional boundaries about how water naturally moves in our system. They'll be nested or edge mapped. We'll be able to stack together and apart. And the modeling consultants have been selected for all the regions across the state. They're just about to start their first task order. We're going to be doing, 2 series of modeling across, the workflow. It's a lot of work. It's going to take time. It's going to help facilitate decision making. And so we're just really getting that wheel turning. We've got a lot of project funds with the Watershed Initiative. We have over $970 million worth of project funds broken into different pots of money. And so we really want to make sure that we sort of position ourselves as a state in the best position possible to use those models to evaluate projects, make sure that they do what we think they're going to do with the best available science and data at our fingertips. And so we're doing this now, early in the program, while we also release project funds for that round 1 to get shovels in the ground immediately. So there's a lot going on with the Watershed Initiative. If you all have any other questions about modeling, please do just let us know. We'll try to get to those questions after we finish so that we don't unintentionally kind of derail. But this is really relevant to the Iowa discussion. There's a lot of components that are similar. I think, and you might have this on the next slide. So I wanted to ask one
what
thing.
I might say about that is the models, these are computer platforms that take data and information, often map or geographical data about land cover, what type of soils, what type of impervious surfaces there are, infrastructure, drainage infrastructure, road infrastructure, and rivers. And it takes what experts, engineering experts and scientific experts know about how water functions in those systems to sort of operationalize how water flows in your region. And then you can take and put, for example, a very strong rain event or different scenarios on top of that and run different scenarios about what will happen, what places might flood, what places might not flood, based on what's known about the sort of topography and infrastructure of your region and sort of state-of-the-art hydrological knowledge.
Exactly. Thank you so much for unpacking that, because I'm too often in a room full of engineers. And so it takes a little step further. And so I think at this point, do you want to switch over to case studies? Or actually, we're moving from case studies into governance. I'm sorry. The 101, and I think this is good. It's a good framing for, what other areas are doing. I'm just checking to see if we want to answer any other questions about these case studies before we move forward. There was one question about Minnesota's watershed districts having roots in water quality management, and have they shifted to include water quantity as well? So like how much water, and is Colorado's focus on water quality or quantity? And I guess I wonder if y'all mean by quantity like risk, right? Too much water, I'm assuming is the risk factor of the flood factor.
So yeah, the watershed management districts have, the urban water management districts in Minnesota, so those are ones that are set up at a metropolitan scale, have a strong stormwater impact. And the ones in Colorado, of course, are focused on hazard base. So that's, catastrophic flooding. So I guess that'd be a quantity if we were to put it under that framework. And the rural ones in Minnesota focus on both. But I think it also is a function, right? To some extent, they're implementing a statewide watershed law, which affects water quality, but also in their design and management of projects, hazard issues are considered, and it's a platform that they're able to do that.
Great. Okay. All right, you ready to go on to Governance 101?
Great.
All right.
So part of the idea here is this: what is this concept of governance? And the excuse me, the issue here in part is you can think about what happens in a watershed in terms of decision making around land use, around infrastructure, around private capital investments, as the sum total, right? Of the actions of all of the individuals involved, and they're influenced by rules and relationships that affect infrastructure, environmental conservation, transportation, emergency response, flood control. So the governance network knits together all of these. And it's not something we make on purpose, right? It's just an emergent system from our management of these different issues. And the institutions, when we think about that, we're thinking about rules, constraints, and structures on people within that. And really, when you're setting up a watershed coalition, you're setting up a strategic organization. Whether it's mandated by state law or it's an NGO, it's a strategic organization that's attempting to influence or regulate the institutional structure of how watersheds are managed and governed, how this network of people interacts in the region. And so I know that's a little bit conceptual here, but you have organizations and groups that are pursuing common interests, and that can be, right, corporate or governmental. So there's this difference between what's the government's governance structure, the institution, which are these sort of structuring roles, and then there are the different organizations. And here we're talking about setting up organizations to affect institutional governance structures. And when we do that, there are some questions, yeah, please go on to the next one, to consider from other areas, which include, now this is a study from the Midwest that they've just done on implementing regional watershed governance, especially in the hazard area, that there's a question of the alignment of human capital, social capital, so those are our relationships to other people, the policies, their goals, and their financial framework, right, along their missions. And that's an important question. So you're trying to align that. And right, and so organizational design, how you set up your watershed coalition should consider those factors. And I sort of phrase it a little bit differently in terms of rules, relationships, resources, and reporting, but it also deals with these same issues. And so if we think about rules, we think about in a region, so those can be development standard, those can be jurisdictional boundaries, those can be authority, right? Those are things that give us a position, give us a role, or mandate certain activities. Relationships, we can think about how do different bodies interact with each other, both formally and informally. Do people in the hazard mitigation department talk regularly with the planning and transportation departments? These kind of relationships. And those, if there are important relationships in terms of learning and knowledge exchange that need to happen at the regional level, or maybe across jurisdictional boundaries, is our watershed organization going to be able to facilitate that? Is it set up and structured to do so? Resources, we just talked about. Everybody already knows that, because if you want to have human capital and you want to build stable relationships, you need to have people dedicated to that, and that requires resources. And then finally is reporting. And this goes back to being a mission-driven organization, whether it be hazard or water quality. And what are your metrics you're using, making those transparent, and also having a way to assess whether you're meeting those goals with your structure, and then if not, being able to review and iteratively evolve. So,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
I was just going to interject because every time I see this, I know you presented this to Region 7. I'm always kind of struck by this sort of things that are happening now and what is in this study. And there's a lot that's happening now across the state that helps to sort of literally materialize these types of things in real time today, right? So we've got, through the Regional Capacity Building Grant, human capital. We are funding the fiscal agents, and they are hiring staff to facilitate this coordination and this relationship building. And the social capital that's coming that's happening as a result of that is really incredible. Like, we're seeing people talk to each other and learn from each other's expertise. All these regional steering committees. I hope, as I say this, all of y'all are kind of sitting back in your chairs and saying, yeah, I've learned a lot in the last month. Even if it wasn't maybe technical information, it may be social information, other people's experiences of water risk or flood risk, maybe just very different, because the regional steering committees are set up to really be representative of the region and not just typical, stakeholder groups that are engaged in flood risk management historically. And so we're seeing sort of a churning of human capital and social capital, and I think we're expecting or anticipating more of a policy and finance framework to result, in the years to come as part of this regional capacity building program, and how it furthers and manifests in reality based on the recommendations that we're going to be working towards in the next month or so. And I think that it's really incredible to watch each region and their steering committee look at sort of this organizational scope and this question of, do we have capacity to do these things, and what are the challenges we face in our regions, and how is that unique to Region 1 or Region 2? And I think we're seeing those things, those monuments kind of get set in the ground, and this becoming more and more clear, which puts us in the best, I think, position possible to tackle these 4 R's, to think about, well, now that we know we have this human and social capital, we know we need to work on the policy and the finance. We know what our challenges are. We're in a better position to address them. Now we can sort of get to the work of putting pen to paper and really making this a reality, so that we can really get to working on the issues that need to be addressed across the state.
So thinking about some of the challenges is that we do, to some extent, have a fragmented institutional structure. Now, whether or not your evaluation of what to do with that, I'm not trying to comment on that, but I think we can empirically sort of observe that, through the fact that we have very autonomous, localized land use decision-making in Louisiana. And we also have planning and development districts that are engaged in planning. And we also have a bricolage. We have sort of a quilt of drainage, gravity, and water districts, which have authority in water management, in the levee districts that have been pointed out. And these aren't necessarily cohesively contemplated under Louisiana law right now, or in terms of management practices, right? There's not a organization at a regional level that's building bridges or engaging these. And as a result, some drainage districts, for example, are often not actively engaged in upstream, downstream problems. And so if you're trying to scale up beyond the scope or scale of some of these very localized organizations, that's one of the reasons to consider regional options.
Yeah, and I would just add too, like when we think about considering the spatial distribution and the authorities and how these entities work together, and why or why not they may or may not be working together. I think Brad just posted to the chat a link to existing resources on regional watershed management in Louisiana. So if y'all are interested, you can go on to Watershed, just click that link that he's got in the chat, and it's watershed.la.gov, where you can go to the regional page, and you'll be able to open a guidebook to local and regional entities in each region of the state, and you can look at maps of the drainage districts and of the soil and conservation districts and water districts and the navigation districts, and see how they overlap or don't overlap, and how they're spatially distributed within each region, and then also a discussion of their existing authorities and the gaps. And so, as part of our work, and then in the next exercise with the regional steering committees, except for region 1 we did yesterday, we talked through all this, but all of the rest of the regions are going to be looking at that guidebook, looking at their region, looking at these entities, and really contemplating, what does this look like for us, and is there an entity that can fulfill this need, and even just coordinating what is in the region.
And so what are the sort of challenges conceptually that are faced? Some of them are, we talked about that, maybe fragmented decision-making. Maybe there are knowledge gaps, which, we don't know exactly the relationship between some of our activities and long-term flood risk. Potentially that could be filled through the hydrological modeling in part, or through future scientific research. There are always questions of uncertainty. There are divergent interests. We have to recognize that when we're thinking about management decisions, that there are trade-offs sometimes, that there can be scarcity, and there are questions of capacity. And getting back to the question of socio-ecological fit, well, what does this mean? Well, it just means that is there a congruence between the scale of an environmental problem, such as flooding, which might happen at stormwater issues might happen at a very small, like, Huck 12 level, but the Amite Basin flooding that happened in 2016 that kicked a lot of this out happened at a Huck 8 level. Is there congruence in terms of our decision making at those scales, right? So if we're making very localized decision making about things that can affect flood risk, how do we then incorporate feedback mechanisms to incorporate those larger scale environmental hazards?
I'm assuming you're going to go to the next slide. Yeah?
Sorry. Yeah. So I just wanted to hark back to this. We saw this when we were doing some of our research that, since we know that as the levee districts show, that Louisiana has been managing water regionally, cross-jurisdictionally, really since the 19th century with the levee districts, and it's in the Constitution of Louisiana. But even in the 1960s, Louisiana identified a need for multi-jurisdictional drainage solutions. This is from a study, some legal aspects of water use in Louisiana by M.E. Borton, published in the Louisiana Law Review. And they were considering a statewide drainage program because some districts have aggregated drainage and flooding problems in others. But at that time, Louisiana didn't take the step, maybe that some states such as Minnesota did in the 70s, to then set up regional or watershed or comprehensive drainage issues. And in part, and based on the natural hydrology and geology of the state, not attending to those issues has meant that we're still dealing with these problems kind of on the floor one of a skyscraper that has to be built in terms of management 60 years later.
Yeah. And I think we all, as we work in this field, and I mean, as we listen to all the feedback, I don't think we've heard yet this isn't needed, right? Like I've heard, look, parishes can work together, they can enter agreements, there's nothing preventing that. But to really look at the system and the maintenance of these systems at this scale, so that we're not just addressing sort of the squeaky wheel, which is often too easy to do, right? You're busy, and you're trying to address permitting, you're trying to get emergency response out, and like our governments are overtaxed and under resourced, and so this is a different scale that I think collectively I think we've heard we need to manage the system better, and it's not surprising that we saw it in the 60s, and we see Minnesota really successfully executing that today. And so you're right, it's going to take time. This is something I think we can all look back in 20 years and say, Bob, do you remember when we were talking about this in Louisiana? And it seemed like it was really big decisions, but it was, now it's every day. Everybody understands that this is how we operate, and of course we would do it this way. How could we imagine doing it any other way? We're not there yet, but I think we collectively are all saying, yeah, we definitely need to move in that direction. And so if we're not, y'all should call me because I haven't heard that yet. So if you're out there and you're listening and you're like, I don't know what Alice is talking about, I need to give her an earful, please do. Give me a call because we need to get to know each other. And then I think, to turn it back to you, this is how we make it happen, right? Or could make it happen with the region.
And so when we think about some of these authorities, a couple of people I'm looking at some of these comments here. So there's a question. So what are the rules, right? That's an important one to consider. I mean, and I think maybe to think about this from a multidimensional perspective, right? You're trying to think about, well, what are the actual management rules we're considering that are going to affect that, but also the organizational charter. And one of the decisions in the organizational charter can affect, well, resources, it can affect relationships. And so there are questions, is it going to be built under a state charter, such as the Amite Basin Commission or the levee districts here? Is it going to be built in conjunction with environmental or regulatory programs? Is it going to be a citizen-driven or membership-driven organization? Now, I will say that generally, organizations, as they become more regulatory, tend to be more formally composed of actors from local government, because in the American legal and land use system, local governments tend to be some of our most fundamental decision makers in terms of many infrastructure and land use decision-making processes. And is it going to be a collaborative or a civic group? And then what authority do they have? And well, you don't want to set up a 501c3 organization with regulatory ambitions without legal authority to do that. I mean, nobody obviously clearly would do that, but that there needs to be a consideration and a balance of how you set up your organization based on its mission and based on its authorities.
And I'm thinking we have just a couple more slides left. And so maybe we get through those and then we can shift to questions, because we're hitting that 20-minute mark, so we can and then focus on the questions. Awesome.
And you think about the relationships in part through the representational structure. Are you properly institutionalizing your engagement of citizens? And especially in a state such as Louisiana, where flood risk hazards often fall heavily on low income and minority communities that have had traditionally less representation in some of these more technical decision-making things. How do you make those considerations? Are you going to be primarily focused with public representatives? How do you incorporate and get agency buy-in to do that? Or you can use mixed approaches. And in doing that, you need to set up who are your major stakeholders in your organization based on the scale of the management decision, the civic networks that you're able to do. And it might involve multi-tiered structures if you want to have more localized engagement in certain areas, or more regional structures if there are larger discussions of projects of regional impact. Finally, funding. When you set up your organization, one of the main questions to be able to do all of these things is to have a favorable funding base. And I guess it does depend. If you're trying to solve a concrete, acute problem, then maybe grants-based funding, one-off funding, is a fine approach to do that. But you might find limitations in terms of long-term staffing, building trust in local relationships if you don't have stable funding. And finally, reporting and accountability. In terms of justifying the use of public funds, justifying a presence in a public decision-making process, understanding your goals and your metrics to report and show value to your stakeholders and the communities that you represent are fundamental considerations that should be built into structures from day one. So in conclusion, this is just a quick, slightly superficial, mnemonic to think about it, right? Rules, resources, relationships, and reporting. Think about what are the structures of your organization? What are the regulatory structures that it's going to be operating under? What are the other organizations and jurisdictions with authority? How are you going to resource staffing? How are you going to have stable long-term funding? Or are you going to be based around more short-term funding models? How can you build in relationship building across, as we said, wildlife and fisheries, DEQ, FEMA, HUD, local governments, community groups into the structure of your organization to get buy-in? And finally, how are you going to justify metrics of success?
Exactly. I think, you know, a lot of the work that we're doing, I'm hoping as y'all listen, and this is really intended to kind of get you ready for these next steps, right? These are all important questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we go into these next exercises, where we start to narrow our choices, right? We start to narrow in on what makes most sense for your region, and your entity or your potential entity, and thinking about those trade-offs, right? Thinking about, you know, using mitigation funds, right? We have this opportunity with CDBG mitigation funds to a degree to catalyze this effort, to instigate sort of this statewide change and how we look at and mitigate risk, how we manage our risk, and our water. And so I think what we'll be doing is, you know, we'll be discussing with y'all sort of next steps in specific outreach to parish leaders, like building these social networks, making sure people are aware. And then we'll be working with y'all again between March and May to deliberate on how y'all's recommendations, right? So we're going to get to this point, making these recommendations around these 4 R's, and what our future looks like. But then there's this big next step that some of y'all have already brought up. Some of the regional steering committees are asking questions like, how is the state going to work with the entities that we recommend? So not only is there sort of a horizontal alignment across the regions that we need to sort of achieve to make sure we're managing this in a manageable way, we also have to make sure that there's vertical alignment with the state agencies and within the structure, like who and how do we report. And so there's a sort of local ground up operations and outreach that has to take place, but then there's also sort of a top down and middle up. So we're on the whole ladder of participation. And so it's exciting. I think there's a lot of multiple disciplines in this work. We've got engineers, we've got scientists, biologists, naturalists, and community stakeholders that have really not engaged on water, but represent really important perspectives in this work. And so I'm excited to get to this point with all of y'all and to be here today with Dr. Dowsett and talk about what this means, what we should be thinking about, what are potentially the trade-offs, and how can we learn from other states in the country. And so I think at this point, we can kind of switch to some questions. I think we have just enough time, about 15 minutes, to look at. I think we've got a couple that have come in. One of them is an easy one that I can answer really quickly, which is, would we look at buyouts in watersheds? Absolutely, right? Absolutely, yes. We will be looking at buyouts. I think this is one of the sort of simplest, and I say that knowing it's a very complicated process, but we'll make it as simple as possible to execute. But just to get people out of harm's way, where we know risk is increasing, where we know they're tired of having to recover, and they're willing to be bought out, where we can isolate those neighborhoods and provide them those funds and a housing incentive to help them relocate somewhere that's safer outside of the special flood hazard area. We are actively working on this, and I hope to be able to speak more about this very soon. We have a lot of buyout projects in the round 1 eligible applications, so already we're kind of looking at these. They're churning, but I think there's more to come, and that's kind of a project type that just doesn't have negative impacts, right? It's not going to, there's no downstream impacts to that. And it helps people most immediately. So that was a long answer to a short yes. So I'm going to zip it and go to the next question. Evelyn, do you want to provide that next question summary?
I have a few queued up for y'all. If y'all are comfortable with this, I want to kind of combine two that I'm seeing are very similar. I'm seeing a question from Blaze and a question from Austin, and I want to see how y'all respond to it. Blaze's question says, how does LWI reach any goals if they don't have the force of law? Lack of enforcing rules is why we're dealing with so much flooding. And then I think y'all already spoke to the latter part of his question, was asking about soil and water conservation districts and how they fit into that. Now, Austin's question is similar. It says, would enabling legislation for the council or the steering committee be possible if we don't take a volunteer-based approach like Colorado? So what I'm hearing is questions about how do we get the authority that we need to address some flooding problems that are major.
So I'm gonna defer to Dr. Dowsett first, and then I'll weigh in after if he wants to weigh in first.
So I guess there are different ways to think about change, right? So there's a framework that's in one of the textbooks I teach in an environmental law and policy class that has 5 P's for it's a prescriptive regulation, penalties, payments, persuasion, and well, I'm missing the last P right now. I'm failing my own quiz, but the payments and, are you able to build a persuasive coalition at the regional level, maybe by managing models? So I guess if your theory of why there are problems in Louisiana rests on the fact that there's not good information sharing or understanding, then maybe a persuasive organization with data models, sort of the Iowa approach, could be useful. If your theory about the problem you're facing goes beyond that, involves decision-making around land use or infrastructure in ways that involves regulations at a local or regional level, then there has to be a consideration of state authority. There's some options potentially, and I think there are other people probably better positioned to answer this. For example, jurisdictions can come together and form water quality districts across borders under Louisiana law, but that's a limited solution, and it's difficult to negotiate every partner in that way. So there are different options, and there are different levels of authority, and certain things do require legislative action.
Yeah. And I think, just to kind of weigh in from a programmatic perspective, I think we would say that all the options are on the table. We're committed to figuring out what is the right formula for making this work. And so as we think through these options and trade-offs and the challenges that we face in the regions, there is kind of a, what is the equation that works, that equals, success for the state? And if that means legislation, we're going to have to work together to figure out what that looks like. And how to execute it. And we're, I think, prepared collectively to do that. I've never seen in my life a planning process similar to this that has as much momentum as we do at this point. And so I think we just need to really kind of keep on track, keep focused on these challenges, and keep asking these questions that are really critical to building consensus around whatever solution we end up landing on, so that when it gets to the point where we have to cross the finish line, or I would say maybe start the race, depending on how you look at it, that there's no one kind of, calling us back, to start over. This is purposely very transparent so that we can be very sure of the course moving forward. And so I think we're open to what that is. And I think, not to speak for the fiscal agents, watershed coordinators, the regional steering committees, but that's a similar sentiment that I've heard across. We're all actively, earnestly looking for ways to improve water management at the regional and local and state level.
And in terms of whether it's possible, I'd say that I don't think it's a secret from political science that legislative members represent districts and are extremely concerned about the the local authorities and people who live in their districts. And so they're going to do things that they think are in the best interest of their district. And to the extent that they're going to make changes in state law, it's going to be engaging those stakeholders is probably an important facet of the process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would just too, I'm seeing a question from George Silvertooth, like keep in mind, the program staff that help develop LA Safe and Elders on Charles are part of our team. So there is alignment across these state agency programs that are happening in and around the coastal parishes where we're focusing on adaptation and buyouts. And so just keep that in mind. Like we're in lockstep with them, and they're informing these programs that we're developing and launching. And similarly with the FEMA Ecosystem Service Benefits BCA, the council quite literally drafted a letter requesting that these things be considered in their programming. So we're, again, really on the same page with making sure the decisions that we make are as comprehensive as possible and take into account these other considerations.
That's helpful. Thank you for addressing that question about ecosystem. We had two questions, one about ecosystems benefits. Does the program look at that? And then similarly, that question about BCA. I just want to make sure too, we do have some information on the website that I think speaks to those issues. And you're right, Alex, that's very much a part of the program. So thank you again for covering that. I see a comment from Mart saying, I'm beginning to think that there will need to be state enabling legislation for the regional watershed management structure to work. So thank you, Mart, for adding that. We have an interesting kind of legal question. Dr. Dosa, you may want to take a look at this one. I'm seeing it. It says, there was a mention of a lack of upstream, downstream consideration when approaching parish level watershed impact. Have there been instances where parish or county level governments chose to litigate over development requirements and potential upstream or downstream impact?
I know there are cases of litigation where this exists. I know there even in Iowa, there have been cases of litigation regarding agricultural pollution. And in Louisiana, there are examples of this. And I'm not exactly sure what the question is, in terms of, you have to see in state law what the standards are regarding different management practices and whether you can establish precedent in terms of something showing that an action in one place has an effect or cause on another one. So that's always one way that these issues can, in some cases, be addressed, but hopefully a more collaborative approach can avoid a court-determined outcome to some. It's also, litigation also tends to build more ad hoc outcomes versus comprehensive solutions to issues.
That's helpful. Thank you. I think y'all have addressed, oh, you know what? We have one more question that we haven't addressed. Let me read this to y'all. To what extent can CDBG MIT funds be used to build regional water management authorities? Are there any limitations in the activities that can be funded?
This is great. So right now, the Regional Capacity Building Grant is funded through flood funds, which are from the 2016 event. They're planning funds. I think that the answer is yes. If you look to the action plan for the mitigation funds, there's a whole section that speaks to regional capacity building around these entities and supporting their long-term health to stand up this process and really catalyze this work across the state. And so I think that's the intent. That's how it's been, planned, and the public's lead in, right? So it's a collective conclusion that the state has reached, that this is an important use of these funds. The limitations, I would say, are really outlined in the policies and procedures for the program. So I don't want to go too much in the detail there, but there are some, kind of financial limitations related to like overhead, certain things that we would just need to get with their departments on, but we could talk about that at another point in time if y'all are interested in that specific issue.
Thank you. You know, I see a comment here that is specifically asking about how models are prepared. It says, I would recommend that these base geospatial data sets mentioned, land cover, soils, elevation, et cetera, have a set statewide standard and availability to water management teams. Alex, I'm sure you've got an answer on that, so I want to make sure we get that through.
Right. I think rest assured, we have a lot of experts who are thinking about data standardization and data management, so that the 7 modeling teams that are doing all the buckets across the state are managing their data in a consistent way, so that we not only can build models, but also create data sets that could inform other types of decisions or considerations within the science and academic fields and within the agencies as they sort of plan their own activities and think about their next steps in implementing their missions. And so I do think we have a lot of capacity there. The models themselves, you know, we have sort of primary and added value objectives. I think there was another question about ecosystem benefits. So this is something that if a region, you know, we're trying to set up these models to sort of do a lot at a large scale, but then over the long term, as the regions begin to plan a regional strategy and identify maybe unique challenges to their own region, they could adapt those models to address those additional considerations. So you could potentially have FEMA flood maps created from the models. If that's something your region wants to do or a parish in your region wants to do, you could add that as an added objective. You could look at ecosystem benefits as an added objective. You could add to these models and make them more unique. Because we know, like when the state does stuff, you know, we don't want to generalize, but we kind of have to if it's a big effort. But we want to add that flexibility to be unique and to right size to these regions and address the challenges that they face. So there's a couple of added value objectives that we're enabling these models to sort of address at a later date as we move forward with the planning effort. And if that doesn't answer y'all's questions, feel free to email us at watershed.la.gov. It's a big question, and I'm not an engineer, so you know, I know I see Ian on here. Ian, if you want to weigh in the chat, please do. You know, if I'm missing something important. Ian, DOTD and OCD are in lockstep, right, with the modeling program.
So y'all were right at 4:29. I do want to make sure that y'all get a chance to kind of say anything that you want to say in closing. I know we still have some maybe follow-up requests. We're going to take this chat, and if anyone, you know, I don't see anything right now except for some questions about links to certain materials, which we'll certainly answer. But if anyone has ongoing issues or questions, like Alex said, there's an email address. You can put them in the chat, and y'all just go right ahead with your closing.
Exactly. And I would just mention, too, we're kind of, as we introduce more people to the initiative, we've been doing a lot of foundational work over the last year in implementing the program, but we're really starting to kind of move towards a more outreach and engagement-centered approach that focuses on communities and stakeholders. So please do, if this is the first time that you've engaged with us, please do follow, you know, us on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram, Twitter. You know, we're pushing out information that will help you sort of stay engaged and stay up to date with the program as all of these different initiatives continue to move forward and more programs are launched that are in the action plan. And so thank you all for joining us today and giving us your time as we talk about this work that's so important. And I think it's going to help. It helps me prepare for these big decisions and help facilitate y'all through this process. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bassett, and we're good to go.
No, I would like to, you know, I think if my email is not there, it's tdouthit. I'll put it in the chat if people want to. I'll put that in the chat if there are questions. If not, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing where this goes throughout the state and all the decisions that are made.
Great. And we'll definitely send everyone a link to the slides after they're posted online. So don't worry, we'll get those to you. You'll have a wonderful Wednesday afternoon.